People argue about ideology like it's the engine of politics. Left versus right. Religion versus secularism. Nationalism versus globalism. But the dictator's handbook lands a colder claim: ideology is often the paint, not the machinery. The machinery is simpler, uglier, and far more universal. Leaders don't stay in power by being loved. They stay in power by being needed, by a small set of people who can remove them. If you understand that one sentence, the world stops looking confusing and starts looking almost embarrassingly predictable. The book's core idea is not dictators are evil. That's moral commentary. The core idea is structural. Every leader survives by managing two groups. A large pool of people who could matter, the selectorate, and a much smaller group whose support is actually essential, the winning coalition. The coalition is the only audience that truly counts. Everyone else is noise, sometimes dangerous noise, but still noise. And here's the first uncomfortable punch: the smaller the coalition, the worse the country tends to be for ordinary people, because the leader's rational strategy becomes buying loyalty cheaply from a few insiders instead of serving the many. That's not because the leader wakes up wanting suffering. It's because the incentive map rewards different behavior. If you need millions of voters, you can't pay them off individually. It's too expensive. So you give public goods, roads, safety, health systems, stable currency, functioning institutions. Not because you are virtuous, but because it's cost-effective. Public goods are cheap when your coalition is huge because they scale. One highway serves millions, one stable legal system lowers risk for everyone. In broad coalition systems, competence becomes a survival trait. But if your coalition is small, generals, oligarchs, party bosses, security chiefs, public goods become wasteful. Why build a high-functioning system for everyone when you only need to satisfy a few hundred people who can end you? In that world, public goods are a dangerous luxury, because they empower outsiders. A richer, healthier, more educated public is harder to control, more capable of organizing, more likely to demand accountability. So the rational leader shifts toward private goods, contracts, monopolies, cash, villas, protection, access, immunity. Loyalty becomes a purchased commodity. This is why corruption isn't just a problem in many regimes. It can be a design feature. It's a leash. If your inner circle is corrupt because you allowed it, then you own their secrets. They can't easily defect without risking prosecution, exile, or worse. Corruption becomes the glue of mutual hostage-taking. You're not tolerating theft, you're underwriting dependence. Notice what this does to your entire view of political theater. You stop asking, why don't they just do what's best for the country? And start asking the only question that predicts outcomes: what's best for the coalition that keeps them in power? Once you adopt that lens, the hypocrisy isn't surprising anymore. It's almost inevitable. Leaders talk about the nation. They govern for the coalition. Here's where the book gets disturbing in a very practical way. It implies that some of the policies ordinary people celebrate as strong leadership are often just coalition maintenance. A sudden crackdown on corruption can be moral theater, or it can be a purge of rival networks. A public war on traitors can be national defense, or it can be a cheap way to justify tightening control, expanding security budgets, and raising the cost of dissent. The mechanism is not ideology, it's survival. Think about the logic of fear. Fear is efficient when your coalition is small, because you don't need to persuade everyone, you only need to deter enough people from organizing. Repression is a public good for the dictator, it protects the coalition. But repression also has a cost: it can make the leader hated, and hatred can unify the opposition. So the smartest authoritarian systems don't rely on raw terror alone. They use targeted fear, selective punishment, uncertainty, surveillance, combined with selective rewards. Enough pain to paralyze coordination, enough privilege to keep insiders loyal. This creates one of the book's most cynical truths: ordinary citizens are rarely the main target of the leader's generosity. The leader's generosity is aimed at those who can remove them. Public generosity, welfare, subsidies, grant projects, often exists when it buys legitimacy that indirectly stabilizes the coalition, or when it's funded by outsiders. If foreign aid pays for hospitals, great. The leader gets credit without sacrificing private goods to insiders. If resource revenue pays for cheap fuel, also great, until the price drops and the leader must choose between the crowd and the coalition. The coalition wins. Now ask yourself a question that should make you uneasy. In your own country, who is the coalition? Not the people who complain online. Not the people who vote once every few years. Who are the people whose defection would actually end a career? The party donors? The media gatekeepers? The security bureaucracy? The corporate alliances? The internal party machine? The unions? The judiciary? The civil service? The answer changes the behavior you should expect. The book forces another uncomfortable insight: democracy is not good leaders and dictatorship is not bad leaders. Both are systems of incentives. Democracies can produce terrible outcomes if the coalition is effectively small, if real power depends on narrow donor networks, factional primaries, captured institutions. Dictatorships can produce stability or even prosperity if the leader's coalition requires broad competence, often because economic performance is necessary to keep the coalition fed. But don't romanticize that, the mechanism remains the same. Survival. This is why the book's title is Genius and Brutal. It's not the dictator's psychology. It's a handbook, a description of how political survival works, independent of morality. And the most chilling implication is that many leaders don't fail because they are incompetent. They fail because they are competent at the wrong objective. They optimize for staying in power, not for national flourishing. If those objectives align, you get a decent society. If they diverge, you get a regime that looks insane from the outside but makes perfect sense internally. You can see this in places where leaders keep the population poor while the elite becomes absurdly rich. Outsiders say, how can people tolerate this? The answer is, they don't need to tolerate it, they need to be unable to coordinate against it. A poor, divided, exhausted public is easier to manage. The regime doesn't need love. It needs disorganization. And then there's the book's sharpest economic knife, loyalty norms. In small coalition systems, loyalty is everything, and competence can even be dangerous. A brilliant minister might become popular. Popularity is a rival power base. Rival power bases are threats. So leaders sometimes prefer loyal mediocrity to brilliant independence. The result is predictable: institutions rot, projects fail, and the state becomes a machine for transferring wealth upward. This is why you can watch the same tragedy repeat. A leader fills positions with loyalists. The loyalists perform badly. The leader responds by tightening control, not by improving institutions. Control protects loyalty. Institutions empower competence. The leader chooses control. The society spirals. If you want a shocking example, you don't need sensational stories. Just look at how some states handle disasters. The initial response is not problem solving but narrative control. Why? Because in fragile regimes, the biggest threat isn't the disaster, it's the appearance of incompetence that could fracture elite loyalty and trigger public coordination. So the regime lies, suppresses, punishes whistleblowers, and performs theater. From the outside, it looks irrational. From the inside, it's coalition defense. Now pause and sit with this question: how many policies you've debated in your life were never about the stated goal, and were always about coalition stability? The book also explains why revolutions are so hard. People imagine a revolution as a moral awakening. Citizens finally refuse. But in this framework, revolutions happen when the coalition shifts. When key insiders decide the leader is no longer the best bet. When the security apparatus fractures. When the money stops. When foreign backing changes. Mass protests matter, but often as a signal that the cost of repression is rising or that insiders can defect safely. And that's why popular support is often less important than people think. A leader can be widely hated and still survive if the coalition is paid and the opposition is disorganized. Conversely, a leader can be broadly liked and still fall if elites defect. The public is emotionally central, but structurally secondary. If this feels bleak, it should. But it also offers clarity. It tells you where power really lies, in the small set of actors who can credibly remove leaders. That's where pressure works. That's where incentives change. One more unsettling thought before we cross into the second half: if you want to predict whether a leader will reform, don't ask whether they have a good heart. Ask whether reform threatens the coalition. Real reform reduces corruption, strengthens institutions, and creates rules. Rules reduce discretionary power. Discretion is the currency used to buy loyalty. So reform, in many systems, is political suicide unless the coalition structure changes first. And that leads to the truly uncomfortable question you don't want to ask: if your livelihood depends on a system's dysfunction, contracts, patronage, favoritism, would you support reform that makes society fairer but makes you replaceable? A lot of political behavior becomes obvious once you answer honestly. Once you accept that politics is coalition management, the world becomes a series of repeating patterns, like a song you suddenly recognize everywhere. The same chorus plays in different languages. You start noticing that national interest is often a costume worn by private interest. You see why leaders love big, vague threats. Why they manufacture enemies. Why they praise unity while rewarding division. Why they can be outwardly strong and internally terrified. Because here's the paradox: the more power a leader accumulates, the more fragile they can become, since more people want their seat. Power attracts predators. The seat is warm. The knives are real. The book's coldest lesson is that the leader's greatest threat is often not the public. It's the insiders. The ministers, generals, oligarchs, party chiefs, the people who can coordinate removal. And because insiders are the threat, the leader's strategy becomes managing their incentives and keeping them mutually suspicious. Divide your opponents, and you don't need to defeat them. they defeat each other. If every insider believes defection is risky and loyalty is profitable, the leader survives. This is why authoritarian systems often look like organized paranoia. It's not madness. It's game theory with human faces. The leader cannot allow any single insider to become too powerful. So they rotate positions, fragment institutions, create overlapping security agencies that watch each other, and maintain ambiguity about who is trusted. Ambiguity is a weapon because certainty helps coordination. The same logic explains why some leaders tolerate incompetent cronies. Incompetence is safe. An incompetent loyalist won't inspire a rival coalition. A competent independent might. Now bring this closer to home with an uncomfortable question: how often do you confuse competence with virtue in leaders? The book forces you to separate them. A leader can be highly competent at survival while producing social decay. They can be brilliant at staying in the chair while the building burns. And many people will call that strength, because they confuse dominance with direction. Here's another pattern you'll start seeing everywhere: the difference between public goods and private goods is not just economics. It's psychology. Public goods create citizens. Private goods create clients. A citizen expects rights. A client expects favors. A citizen can demand. A client must beg. So regimes that rely on private goods tend to cultivate clientelism, loyalty networks, personal favors, selective enforcement. The law becomes flexible for friends and rigid for enemies. And once that becomes normal, moral language becomes theater. People don't ask what is right. They ask who is protected. That's when a society becomes spiritually exhausted, because it teaches everyone that integrity is expensive and loyalty is the only currency. And yet, here is where the book gets even more uncomfortable. This isn't only about dictators over there. The logic is scalable. Any organization, government, corporation, university, even a social group, has a selectorate and a coalition. The CEO survives by satisfying the board. The manager survives by satisfying the people who approve promotions. The influencer survives by satisfying the algorithm and audience. Survival incentives are everywhere. So the question becomes personal. In your own life, who is your coalition? Who do you prioritize to survive socially, financially, emotionally? Whose approval do you buy with your behavior? This is where the book stops being political commentary and becomes a mirror. Now, on the political level, one of the most shocking implications is how foreign aid and external money can prop up terrible systems. If a leader can fund private goods for the coalition without taxing the public loses leverage. Taxes are bargaining power. When citizens pay, they demand. When revenue comes from oil, minerals, or foreign aid, the leader can ignore the public and still pay the coalition. That's why resource curse dynamics recur. It's not mystical. It's incentive math. A regime funded by external rents doesn't need an economy that empowers people. It needs a pipeline that enriches insiders. The society becomes an extraction machine. And the leader's job becomes protecting the pipeline, not developing the country. That's why you see states with enormous natural wealth and miserable populations. It's not that leaders don't know how to develop. It's that development changes the coalition dynamics. Development creates alternatives. Alternatives create disloyalty. Here's a brutal thought experiment the book practically dares you to do. Imagine you are a leader with a small coalition. You can either build strong institutions that make the country richer over 20 years, but those institutions also make you replaceable. Or you can keep institutions weak, skim wealth now, and buy loyalty directly. Which option maximizes your survival? The second. Which option maximizes the country's future? The first. The conflict is structural. That's why good dictator stories are so seductive and so rare. Occasionally a leader chooses long-term national development over short-term coalition bribery. Sometimes they do it out of ideology, sometimes out of vision, sometimes because their coalition structure forces it. But the system constantly pressures them back toward the survival strategy: pay insiders, control outsiders, avoid empowering rivals. And this is where democracies get their own uncomfortable examination. Democracies work when the winning coalition is genuinely broad. But what happens when it quietly narrows, through gerrymandering, captured media ecosystems, donor dependency, polarizing primaries, or institutional choke points? The leader's real audience shrinks. The incentive to deliver public goods weakens. The incentive to deliver targeted benefits increases. You can have the outward rituals of democracy with inner coalition incentives drifting toward oligarchy. So the question stops being democracy versus dictatorship and becomes how large is the coalition that matters? Because that single number predicts whether leaders will invest in education or in patronage, in hospitals or in propaganda, in competence or in loyalty. Another deeply unsettling point: people often believe that if they expose corruption or hypocrisy, leaders will be forced to change. But exposure only matters if it threatens the coalition. If the coalition is still paid, scandal is survivable. The public can rage for months, The leader survives if the insiders stay fed and the opposition can't coordinate. This is why outrage can become a ritual that changes nothing. It's emotionally satisfying but strategically impotent unless it moves coalition incentives. That leads to a hard question. How many political movements fail because they aim their pressure at public opinion instead of at coalition stability? How many wins are symbolic because they don't change the incentive architecture? Now, here's the part people don't like hearing. The public often participates in its own manipulation because moral stories feel better than structural stories. This leader is evil is emotionally clean. This leader is responding to incentives we haven't changed is less satisfying, and more demanding. Because if incentives are the problem, then you don't just need a new leader. You need new rules, new institutions, new enforcement, new coalition realities. And that's harder than chanting a name. The book's final sting is that even revolutions can reproduce the same machine if they don't change coalition size. People overthrow a dictator, celebrate, and then the new leader faces the same survival incentives: pay the coalition, suppress rivals, use patronage. The face changes, the structure remains. That's why some revolutions produce freedom and some produce a new kind of cage with a new flag. So what does hope look like in this worldview? Not naive optimism. Precision. If you want better governance, you need incentives that reward public goods. That means broad coalitions, transparency that actually threatens insiders, institutions that reduce discretionary bribery, and economic structures that don't allow leaders to fund coalitions without citizen bargaining power. But the most uncomfortable question is the one you can't avoid after reading this book. Would you personally choose the harder path if you had power? Would you trade personal security for institutional strength? Would you stop rewarding loyalty and start rewarding competence if that made you vulnerable? It's easy to demand virtue from others when we are not the ones holding the knife edge. The deeper point is this: the dictator is not just a person. It's a role created by incentive structures. And the book is telling you that the role will select for certain behaviors regardless of the actor's morality. Put a saint into a small coalition system and you still pressure them toward patronage. Put a cynic into a broad coalition system and you pressure them toward public goods. The system drags the soul. That's why this book feels like a cold shower. It doesn't flatter your beliefs. It doesn't comfort you with simple villains. It asks you to stop romanticizing politics and start seeing it like engineering: inputs, incentives, constraints, outputs. And once you see it that way, you'll notice something else, something even more personal. You'll start recognizing coalition games in everyday life. In workplaces, friend groups, families, online communities. Who has removal power? Who gets paid in private goods? Who gets public goods? Who is the coalition and who is decoration? If you're brave, you'll ask the final question the book leaves hanging in the air like a threat. When you complain about leaders, are you complaining about people, or are you refusing to look at the incentive system that would shape you the exact same way if you had the seat? That question is uncomfortable for a reason. Because it's asking whether your moral certainty is actually wisdom, or just distance from temptation.